Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro Podcast. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro, partner and director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rob and I are back at it for our weekly chat. I say this in the podcast, but I want to say it up front. COVID has run rampant through my household this week. I'm doing okay, all things considered, but a few pounds lighter and a little worse for the wear. So if I seem not quite as on top of my game, maybe you wouldn't have noticed at all, but I feel not as on top of my game as I usually am. Because I've been spending time in bed and caring for my beautiful family. So if you pick up on any of that, that's why. And we're probably going to be a little behind in our cadence for the next week or two for guest interviews, just because I've had to push some things back. So apologies for that. I'm in the interim. Other than that, the whole point of this episode was to say there's a whole world out there outside of the U.S. presidential election. So we spend a couple minutes talking about Kamala Harris and the change in the Democratic Party, but I tried to spend the rest of the episode talking about all the other places in the world that we are watching while everybody else is focused on election drama in the United States. I also say this at the end of the podcast, but we meant to talk about a really interesting paper about a guaranteed income and what that does for labor supply and U.S. workers. We didn't get to it. We're going to talk about it next week. If you want to read it ahead of time, the name of the paper is the Employment Effects of a Guaranteed Income, Experimental Evidence from 2 U.S. States. Easy to find on Google, but if you want me to send it to you directly, you can email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. That is also where you can email me if you want to talk about me speaking at your event, if you want to talk about investment or advisory services, or if you just want to shoot the shit about anything you heard in this podcast today. So I hope you are all staying healthier than I have been this week. Take care of the people you love. Cheers. See you out. All right, listeners, I've had COVID how many times have you had COVID, Rob? This is my second journey with it.
At least 2 that I know of.
Yeah, so this is number 2 for me. Still unpleasant. I was joking with a friend that it's starting to feel like 2020. U.S. politics is going crazy. There's monkeypox rising in Africa. I have COVID again, whatever else. So this could go one of two ways. Either I'm going to be so unhinged, I'm going to be completely brilliant because the filter is going to be gone. I'm just going to tell you the things that I've been wanting to tell you the whole time, and the the sheer impact of the week is going to come on me, or I'm going to sound completely nonsensical. Either way, Rob, I'm playing with house money, so I don't know what you're going to do here. I'm freewheeling.
As usual, I'm going to follow your lead. That's what I'm going to do.
Okay, so let me try to not drive us into darkness. We've talked a lot about U.S. politics, and I know we don't want to talk about U.S. politics on this podcast, so I will just ask you one quick question, and we will move on to what's going on in the world and an interesting study that you found at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Any hot takes on Kamala and about the sudden reverse in momentum in Democratic politics?
Not really, and I think the reason is because when we discussed our analysis the last few weeks about what's going on at the bigger level, that analysis was sort of independent of the individual candidates or what's going on. And I think we spoke about how sort of the policy objectives and sort of the fundamental issues about populism versus, kind of the forces of reason, as we would say, they're not going to go away. And I don't think this really changes any of that. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But fundamentally, I think the analysis and the takeaways and the things to look for are pretty much the same. What do you think?
I think it's a little too early to tell. I remember Kamala running in the previous election cycle, and what a mitigated disaster she was as a candidate. She's been VP now for several years, so she has now experience being at the center of attention, which other Democratic candidates don't. She is young. Um, she is a woman, and that allows her to hammer on the abortion issue. We'll learn about maybe what she thinks, because one of the confusing things about her is, to me, she's always been a cipher. Like, I don't really know what she wants from a policy perspective. I don't think anyone knows what she wants from a policy perspective. So I go from, I knew exactly what Biden was going to do in his second term. I don't really know what Kamala's going to do if she won. She's kind of a question mark there, but there's not a whole lot she can do. I'm also not sure it changes the race that much. I mean, we're talking about a couple swing states in the Midwest. She was vice president for the government that oversaw. I mean, I think the inflation data is better than the polls suggest and how people feel about it. But people blame the Biden administration for the inflation and for all these economic problems. And she was part of that administration. So I think it's a little too early to tell. I do think it's interesting to watch the media do this complete 180, just hammering Biden and the Democrats are dying and everything is terrible to, oh, wow, like it's get into next gear, Kamala and the memes and the Democrats are back and they're raising money. And it's like, guys, like she's still the underdog in the race. So I don't think we need to say anything more than that. But I will say, to the extent I'm doing anything, it's trying to read the tea leaves for what kind of policy she would have if she would come into office, because I don't have a firm handle on what policies she would pursue, and I don't know if she has a firm handle on that. The only portfolio she had that was related to foreign policy as vice president was immigration, and not exactly a good record to stand on there. So we'll see. Um, why don't we move away from that? Because we've done a lot of U.S. politics. I thought we should at least address it and move on. The world continues to spin, even if these are not the stories that other people want to tell. Why don't we back into the rest of them just by starting with a little U.S. Mexico? There were three things that happened in U.S. Mexico relations over the course of the past week or so that caught my eye. The first was Mexico's president-elect, so Claudia Sheinbaum. She had some pretty pointed comments for Donald Trump. So Donald Trump um, said some not nice things about her incoming economy minister, Marcelo Ebrard, who was, I believe, he was the foreign minister under the previous Mexican government. Called him a stupid person with a low IQ. That sounds like Donald, doesn't it? Said that, yeah, pretty bad. And Sheinbaum said, I mean, she was polite. She said, I regret his rude language and disagree with his opinion. One of the best public servants in Mexico, blah, blah, blah. And he will be a great Secretary of Economy for our country, which no one should forget is free and sovereign. That was a nice little jab to have in there at the end. So I've sort of talked about, if it's Trump, like, this is not AMLO anymore. On that note, though, AMLO actually, after a couple days ago, said that he was going to send a letter to Donald Trump, his good friend, a man of intelligence and vision, to tell him that he really needed to stop blaming Mexico for the border crisis and for blaming migrants for bringing drugs into the United States. So even AMLO, who is Trump's buddy, sort of saying, "Hey, Donald, like this is not how things need to look if we're going to go forward." But in some ways, the most interesting was Mexico's finance minister gave a big interview and spoke at a big event over last weekend where AMLO was there and the president-elect was there. And he talked about how Mexico needed to review its trade relationship with China because it isn't reciprocal. And he talked about how AMLO had charged him with developing something called Plan Mexico, which was to create an awareness that Mexico, like North America as a whole, needs to produce more than it consumes, and that Mexico is depending way too much on basic products from China into Mexican homes and in Mexican manufacturing and things like that. And that's the sort of silver lining underneath all of this, because as much as I think any Mexican government would like to develop some independence from the United States, and maybe it would like to use China to do that, it's very difficult to do that in practice because of how overwhelmingly dependent the Mexican economy is on the United States. And to hear that Mexico is already sort of beating the drum about, hey, China's a problem, we need to figure out China, like that to me feels like hedging your bets and preparing for, hey, Mr. Trump, like we agree with you, we agree on China, we've already done X, Y, and Z, what other things can we do to improve U.S. Mexico relations? So a bit of a grab bag there, but those were three, I thought, fairly notable things in the context of U.S. Mexico relations going forward.
Yeah, incidentally, I've been reading for the last few weeks Enrique Krautz's Mexico Biography of Power, which you recommended to me a few years ago. And if anyone is listening, because I don't think this book exists, but someone should write a book that is a history of Mexico-U.S. relations, especially around the border, because that is a fascinating story to be told. Um, but the the thing that really stuck out to me was the third point that you made, or that you brought up about what the finance minister was saying, because this gets to the issue that we were talking about last week of two different things. The first is, you know, sort of the notion of beggar thy neighbor policies. So historically, when you enter periods of fragmentation lack of cooperation from a trade standpoint, you get this sort of dynamic where countries start going after each other and blaming primarily the current account surplus countries. So in prior weeks, I've said, that China is really the vulnerable one in aggregate. It's always the current account surplus country that is vulnerable, just like the US was vulnerable in the 1920s, in a different era. Um, it's very interesting that Mexico is saying this. And, the slide that you always include with your sort of high level presentations with the spheres of influence, like this almost seems like a direct illustration of that, because in Mexico, it sounds like is saying, you know, even though we have major disagreements with you, United States, and we always have going back, 200 years or so, we're going to align with you on this issue, because just like the US, Mexico does not want to run a current account deficit, for better or for worse. Like you can argue whether that's smart or not, but that's a major factor, because as we said, trade settles multilaterally, it doesn't settle unilaterally. So to the extent that Mexico does implement tariffs or side with the United States on some of these things, it's likely to increase the integration between Mexico and the US, which has been so strong recently. And as AMLO pointed out, like the US would be so stupid to shut the border, because in 10 minutes, all of the US industrial companies that have facilities along the border and rail tracks coming, from one side to the other, everything would be totally in chaos. That integration would be probably improved, or at least the environment, the sentiment around it would be improved. But Mexico would then be at a disadvantage, because that Chinese trade is going to settle multilaterally somewhere else. Maybe it'll be Brazil that'll start building out its own manufacturing capacity in order to import from China and then re-export. Um, Someone would likely play that Brazil role, or I'm sorry, the Mexico role, because without fixing the underlying Chinese policies that create the current account surplus, that excess supply relative to demand has to go somewhere. Like that's just the arithmetic of it. So it's an interesting development, in many ways, I think.
It is, and it sort of brings up two other interesting things. The first is, and you probably saw this um, when Trump was speaking at the Republican National Convention. He talked about how China had large, auto factories being built across the border in Mexico, and his problem wasn't get rid of those factories, Mexico, send the Chinese away. Trump's move there was to say, China, you must build these factories in the United States. I don't want to see these factories going up in Mexico. Like, enough of this nonsense. So, like, there's an interesting thing happening there where I think Mexico's trying to feel out where to go. I think it's also a really interesting juxtaposition, and I think a positive one in the long term for Mexico versus Brazil, which Lula came out last week and said that his administration was putting together a proposal to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, China and Chinese state media made that, of course, that, oh, China's going to welcome Brazil to the Belt and Road family as quickly as possible. It was a little more circumspect, I think, from Lula, but it was the first time a Brazilian leader was talking about, hey, we want to formally join this thing. And it's not that surprising. I mean, the BRICS include Brazil, and I think Lula has always had a much more positive view of China than his predecessor did, and certainly than other Brazilian leaders have. But the other concerning thing there, or I guess it's also an opportunity for Brazil. I mean, Brazil is muscling out the United States and other commodity producers as the provider for China in things like soybeans and corn. It's also increasing its trade more with China in general, which I've talked about how that may be good in the short term. It's not great in the long run if what Brazil wants to be is the leader in its own backyard. If your economy is completely dependent on sending stuff to China, like you're probably not actually going to become this regional power that we expect Brazil to become. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about either of those things, because it's Mexico using that populist framework. It's quite a sharp divergence, I think, from the news and really the trade developments we've seen out of Brazil in recent months.
Well, I think just getting back to the spheres of influence diagram that you yourself have drawn out, you know, you always put Mexico in the US, the North American sphere of influence, and Brazil is sort of its own sphere of influence. And I think we're seeing that play out in the field. It'll be very interesting to see how Brazil plays this. It seems like they have a lot of incentives to try to please both sides. Um, One of the issues for Brazil is that the stuff that they export predominantly is not the stuff that the US imports.
Hmm.
So again, trade settles multilaterally, but people talk about the politics in a unilateral direction. So the US is not going to feel like they're too beholden to Brazil, and Brazil is probably not going to feel like they're too beholden to the US, even though the US is the consumer of last resort. And if you really think about it, Brazil is sending commodities to China, and China is, using those commodities to produce stuff for the US. And at the end of the day, US consumption is the bottom line. So um, I don't know how that will play out, but it does support the notion that Brazil is likely to carve out an independent path here between the two to some extent.
Yeah, and this also starts to trape into biofuels because I mean, in the last year, there's been some suspicion that if the United States met all of its quotas and all of the fancy projections that are out there about things like renewable diesel and biodiesel, that maybe there aren't enough soybeans being grown in the United States. Maybe they'd have to go and get some from Brazil, which I'm not sure that I've ever really believed that line of thought. But maybe there's space for the U.S. to import some of these things that Brazil exports. In the U.S. corn, I mean, if you're a U.S. corn farmer, you probably don't want to hear what I'm about to say next. But I mean, the U.S. corn farmer has been saved by ethanol policy. Ethanol policy was a product of a pre-shale United States where energy security was paramount. Doesn't really make sense anymore from an energy security perspective. It certainly does from providing livelihoods for American farmers perspective, and we can debate like what that looks like. But I don't know. There is some space there if you're creative and you have some policy chops and you have political support behind you to do some interesting things, which I just described a unicorn, so it's probably never going to happen. Um, let's move on to something that you flagged, which I thought was really interesting. And again, one of these things that can go under the radar and which I don't think should go under the radar. There has been a massive amount of Cuban migration between 2022 and 2023. I guess I should say immigration. And a lot of it is migration to the United States. It's 10% of Cuba's population, so almost a million people, a little over a million people. It's the largest migration wave in Cuban history. The statistics are just kind of mind-boggling. The population today, or I should say at the end of 2023, is where it was in 1985. According to U.S. border immigration statistics, over 600,000 Cubans have come to the United States seeking asylum at the border with Mexico. This really stuck out to me. Such statistics represent the largest migratory flow in the history of Cuba, both before and after the revolution, much more numerous than any of the previous migratory waves since 1959. And at least one sort of researcher who at the Cuban Research Institute said that maybe these numbers are conservative, like maybe the situation is much worse than that data suggests. Also, at least roughly 80% of those who have left are between the age of 15 and 59. So they're losing folks who are young, who can actually drive productivity and things like that going forward. I hesitate to make too much out of this because people have been expecting the situation between Cuba and the United States to change literally since the Kennedy administration, and it never does. But at some point, it will change. So why don't you riff a little bit on our favorite out there outlier frontier market opportunity in the world?
Well, I don't know how much there is to say other than this is worth paying very close attention to relative to the amount of attention that's being paid to it in the media, which is none virtually. And I think there's a temptation to be like, oh well, Cuba's been a mess for decades. Sort of like, did they declare peace in the Middle East? Like sort of that vague, clueless, not paying attention to the issues. But um, this is it doesn't really work like this. Like systems like this, you can't just continue to bleed for decade after decade and have it be a stable scenario. And in this case, to lose 10% of your population, and by the way, Certain estimates are that they've lost 18% of the population in the last few years. That is a catastrophic decline. And the issue, as you pointed out, is the demographics of who is leaving. It's your most productive, sort of prime period of life people, and the impact that it's having on food production. So I think this is going to connect in some ways to the Egypt discussion that we'll have in a few minutes. But it's very similar in the sense that we're in a different environment now. There's a need to sort of maintain a certain level of production of food, of keeping price levels under control. And because of the volatility that we've seen in the global system, both with energy prices, food prices all over the place, with inflation all over the place, with currency values, in a lot of these countries that are truly unstable, like really starting to let go. And I know Cuba has a pegged currency, but the symptoms are the same, even if you don't acknowledge them through a floating currency. These things tend to resolve very quickly, and especially because inflation and food prices are so closely connected. This is worth watching very closely because um, people will put up with a lot of bullshit in their lives, but when there's nothing in their stomach, then you're reaching a level of kind of basic human necessity that tends to create problems, if that if that makes sense.
It does, and it's one of the things AMLO was going to say in his letter to Trump, and one of the things I think it's important, especially for American listeners of this podcast, to understand the surge in migration at the U.S. Mexico border is not primarily Mexicans. It's not. This is not the 1990s. We're talking about Cubans, Venezuelans, Ecuadorians. We're talking about problems in the rest of South America and in Central America and the Caribbean, and those things are actually impacting Mexico in some ways as much as they are the United States. So Cuba's not alone here. It's just that Cuba has come to the top. And I think another country to watch here is Venezuela. And this is not something I have been watching that closely. I mean, I sort of check in on Venezuela every once in a while because, there's going to be relaxing of sanctions. Then there's sanctions again. They're a big oil producer, all these other things. But Brian Winter, who's the editor of America's Quarterly, and I think one of the best Latin America analysts in the English language, he said something on Twitter yesterday, which sort of stopped me in my tracks. I'm just going to quote his Twitter right now. Wild mixed signals out of Caracas, data points for both those who think Maduro will cheat this weekend in elections and retain power, and those who see at least some possibility of a democratic transition. History happening in the next 5 days, watch closely. And so I sort of went down the rabbit hole a little bit. You had Venezuela's defense minister give a speech, and he said something along the lines of whoever wins, let them start setting up a government, and whoever doesn't win, they should go and take a break. Which, okay, like that's not full-throated support of the Maduro regime at all. And there's been some talk about Maduro trying to shore up military support ahead of the vote. The polls themselves seem to suggest that the opposition is in a good position. All of which is to say, we're talking about Cuba. I don't have the same sort of stark data to tell you about the migration figures with Venezuela, probably because the data is not as good. But you've also had millions of Venezuelans leaving for the exits too. And it sounds like there may be some kind of something. Isn't that great analysis? That's the COVID talking right there. Some kind of something is happening in Venezuela this weekend, this folks. That's why you pay me the big bucks for this cutting geopolitical analysis. The tensions are rising. The pillars of the analytical model have fallen. Anyway, um, all of which is just to say we're looking at Cuba, but I also don't want us to lose sight of Venezuela. I imagine the most likely scenario is that Maduro crushes it. They doctor the results. Everything will be fine. But little blips that suggest that maybe the pressure in Venezuela is also coming to a head. Anything else you want to say there before we segue to our next basket case of a country, Rob?
Well, I have a question for you on Cuba, on your opinion on something, because I can see a number of different outcomes for Cuba. Like, if you assume Cuba sort of continues along the death spiral route that it has been on, at some point that breaks. And my question is, does Cuba turn into another Haiti? in terms of, horrible situation, but it's sort of contained in this one area and the US doesn't really do anything about it? Or does Cuba's geographic position and its importance, because it's so much more important than really anything else in the Caribbean in terms of where it is, how big it is, how close it is to the US, as you know, does that result in some sort of intervention, some sort of policy response to move in to forestall something happening? You know what I mean? Like, how do we think about those issues? And if we were to sort of put on the whiteboard, like, okay, here are the things to look with regard to Cuba over the next 2 or 3 years to see, just from an investment standpoint, because the investment opportunity is really interesting and huge. What are the first signposts to really understand and anticipate before the mainstream realizes what's going on? What would those things be, do you think?
That's a difficult question, and I'll do my best to riff. But honestly, we should go offline and actually get the whiteboard and do this for a couple of hours. But I guess I would say a couple things. The first is this actually does really dovetail with our podcast last week. And if you didn't listen to it, like I thought last week's podcast was I mean, all of our podcasts are absolutely wonderful, but it was particularly good. Its historical perspective. And I bring it up because we were talking about McKinley in that podcast. And this is when the Cuba problem begins. Cuba's been a problem literally since 1898 and victory in the Spanish American War and what the United States is doing there in general. We also started off this podcast talking about Kamala. That's one area of policy that I would sort of put a bright red line over where you could see major change. I could see Kamala changing some things with U.S. relations with Cuba if she managed to get her way into the White House. Obama was trying to push that direction, remember, in his administration. Biden wanted none of that because he was a little bit more old fashioned. I could definitely see Kamala trying to take the Obama page out of the book and trying to improve relations with Cuba in general. Um, Haiti is one model of a scenario. I don't think it's a likely one. Haiti is more like a failed state. It's being run by gangs. It's like a Somalia type situation where you don't really have one center of power. Cuba's not like that. Cuba has, it's a single party dictatorship that's been ruled by basically the same people for the last 3 years. It's Cuba's problem has been control over the population. It has not been a loss of control. Now, if you depose the party, if you get rid of the current leader, whose name is escaping my mind right this second, but it's not a Castro anymore. I forget what his name is. It'll come back to me. Yeah, maybe you could have anarchy in the streets, and maybe you could have gangs and narco violence. But like that's not Cuba's problem right now. I bet you that cartels and narco violence actors, if the Cuban Communist Party did fall, would love to have access to Cuba. So maybe if you got to break down Cuban politics, maybe the actors that move the quickest are not the ones, the big bureaucratic states. They're the ones that, the cartels that just move straight in and take advantage of that kind of anarchy. That's like the really dystopian, horrible scenario.
So, as
On the other,
investors, we should be anticipating and setting up our drug distribution facilities.
well, doesn't every good investor own a chunk of the? Anyway, no, sorry. Maybe that's not funny. So, yeah. But on the other end of the spectrum is, on the far end of the spectrum is Hawaii. Like Cuba should be an American state. And it's sort of an accident of history, honestly, that it wasn't. That says something about the national, um, sentiment of Cuba and people wanting to be independent and things like that. Puerto Rico is maybe the lesser version of this, and maybe it doesn't have to be an outright state. But if you got the deposal of the party, you've got all these Cubans who are in the United States who have been waiting for the collapse of the revolution for literally decades, who would probably sign up to go back to rebuild Cuba, especially if it was with U.S. dollars and things like that. Like you could totally imagine a scenario like that. You also sort of raised, calling it a Grenada scenario is a little bit unfair to Grenada, but like this idea of a U.S. military intervention to forestall, a descent into anarchy and all the things that anarchy would lead to. That seems to be a little bit of a stretch to me, not least because of the things that it would do with U.S. Mexico relations, with U.S. relations with the rest of Latin America. There's a lot of baggage there, but there's no doubt that strategically Cuba is that important for the United States. But you asked me for some signposts, and I think the first signpost it has to be changes in U.S. policy. There has to be some door opening, some consideration that the United States government wants to empower Cubans or wants to let Americans travel to Cuba or wants to let the dollar do things to Cuba over the long term, which, like I said, you had a lot of these signposts during the Obama administration. We weren't working together at that point, but if we were, I probably would have been on the podcast every week saying, Rob, what are we doing to buy sugar plantations in Cuba? Like, we need to go fix up these Airbnbs and stuff. It's going to be great. We're not there yet. And honestly, there might be better opportunities for non-American investors who can get into Cuba without the baggage that American investors are right now. So the things that we would need to see for our signpost to get checked, just, can we get capital in the country? Can we get into the country without having to lie about how we're doing, cultural underwater basket weaving exercises with the Cuban people and bringing them this art form from the United States? Like, you just need some basic ease when it comes to those sorts of things, and maybe you're off to the races. It's also, I'm sorry, I'm droning on a little bit here because you put a coin in the jukebox and now it's playing. It's an interesting crypto country too. Not that crypto is really taking hold there right now, but when you think about what a transition would look like and what currency this country might have in the future, Cuba's the type of country, like El Salvador, like some of these other countries that we've talked about, where crypto could be not just some interesting playthings for ideological folks to put their ideas into as a store of value. It could be a real means of exchange in that country as well. So there's a grab bag of thoughts if you want any of them, or we can move on.
No, I think we could leave it there. I mean, I think it's very interesting to think about also just the size of the Cuban population in the US now and the freshness of those ties. Like, if you think, really, most of these people came between the early 90s, and now there's another huge wave of people who have just come in the last 2 or 3 years. It'll be interesting, and I don't know what the answer to this is, to see how those different groups have different viewpoints and how they, over time, affect policy. And just from an investment standpoint, that's a lot of people lining up who are probably pretty eager to, in a future liberalization scenario or a scenario where ties are improved, probably pretty eager to buy land and real estate and at least have a foothold there. So
Yeah. And I can't really think of a good analogy like that, where you have a population in exile that is waiting for a turn in government and could see that turn in their lifetime. It could, by the way, it could not change for another 100 years, but we're talking about what if it does change. I'm struggling to think of any kind of example. Like, maybe Rwanda. Like, maybe you could talk about that, where you had exiles who came in after the genocide and took over the government for good and bad, and that economy has sort of taken off. Maybe you could talk about East and West Germany as like a rough analogy of this, where, when you get the reunification of Germany, West Germans can go into East Germany with their capital and pick things up. I don't know though. Like, it's not a normal scenario. I'd have to crunch that a little bit more.
certainly not in the US, because just physically not much is close to the US. Like Rwanda, or you can think like maybe Somalia. Like the US has a large Somalian immigrant population in places like Minnesota and stuff like that. But they're so far away from Somalia. It's not like Cuba is right there. Like, you could literally just jump on a boat and be there in a few hours.
Yeah,
That's we've never experienced something like that. So I don't know if
yeah.
there is
I
any
mean,
benchmark you can look at.
and Teddy Roosevelt did that himself, right? He jumped on a boat and ran around with a horse and charged a hill or something like that, to great fame. You talked about how Cuba had been a mess for decades. It has been a mess for decades. Let's talk about another country that's been a mess for decades, but really the last decade plus has been really bad. Egypt, and we've talked a little bit about Egypt on the podcast, probably from an outside point of view, from its investment perspective, because I don't see a lot of investors going out there eager to buy Egyptian equities or Egyptian government bonds or things like that. But it is arguably the most important country in the Arab world. It's the center of it was the center of the Arab Spring, which continues to remake the Middle East in strange ways. And there were a couple different things this week that sort of struck me when we were talking about Egypt. The first was that despite the government running out of money, Egypt said that it had been able to import a lot of LNG, so that they were cutting scheduled power cuts over the summer. That makes it's super hot in Egypt, so it makes sense that that's what you would want to do. But it was kind of remarkable to me that Egypt found the capital to get that LNG into the country, and that that's how they're spending it. That might say something, by the way, about the cost of LNG and about natural gas. I flagged it from that point of view for us as well. At the same time, though, you look at everything else happening in the Egyptian economy. Um, it looks like a death spiral. You've got more devaluation coming. You've got big ticket items like cars and furniture are getting cheaper and cheaper, and Egyptians aren't buying them because they think they're going to get cheaper still. Like everybody's waiting for the bottom to really fall out. We could talk about some of the specifics here. I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about subsidies. It's also Egypt is also difficult to talk about because they already have a deal with the IMF. So the IMF in March promised them more money and will probably help them as much as possible. This is a strategic partner for the United States. The United States is part of the Camp David Accords, or not the Camp David Accords, the Egypt Israel peace treaty gives billions of dollars worth of weapons to Egypt every single year. And the Saudis have been propping up the Egyptians too. Anytime they run out of money, the Saudis come in and give them a nice check, or some of the other Gulf countries do too. So there's a lot of backstop here. So I'm not about to say that the thing is about to blow up, but when we're talking about pressure increasing over time, the pressure is increasing there, and nothing that we are seeing out of the Egyptian economy looks good. So I hand the baton to you there.
Well, I think this is similar to a Cuba situation where really the purpose here is to put it on people's radar screens because it's one of those places that we don't think about too often. And we sort of vaguely think, well, a basket case, but it's been a disaster for a long time. But again, things are much more dynamic now with the volatility spiral, to use that phrase again, that we're going through. And Egypt is one of the flashpoints that I would really keep top of mind. And here's why, right? Um, Not only do they have high government debt, but they're just structurally set up in such a way where their spending is unsustainable. And what I mean by that is governments can spend a lot, but it depends on what that spending is geared toward. So, in the case of Egypt and the case of other countries like it, you're really seeing sort of unproductive spending, not only going into subsidies. So if you look at the official Egypt budget, the federal budget, 25% of the budget is allocated to subsidies, which is mostly pensions. 6% alone is just for wheat subsidies. So
Mm-hmm.
in that case, we're talking about subsidizing the consumption, the everyday consumption of ordinary people. But then the majority of the rest of the Egyptian budget is basically subsidizing the consumption of well connected insiders. Because if you look, and there's actually a really great piece that someone wrote at the Carnegie Endowment, which we can link if people want to read it. It's a really good read, but it talks about all of the interconnections and sort of on balance sheet versus off balance sheet uh, government connected entities that are basically run by the military and well connected insiders, where they're kind of sucking at the teat of the government in terms of subsidized loans, in terms of cost sharing, but they're maintaining in the off balance sheet entities most of the benefits. So the government has kind of become this sort of pool to water all of these enterprises that aren't really doing anything in terms of actual productivity improvement. They're mostly kind of rent-seeking enterprises combined with keeping individual people happy. So that's not sustainable. And the problem is, like we said with Cuba, we're in a different situation now, not only because of food prices, like wheat subsidies are 6% of the government budget, and that's with wheat prices at multi-year lows. So assuming that volatility is going to continue, that's not going to remain that way for long. The country has already devalued twice in the last 2 years. Debt, they have $42 billion in US dollar denominated debt. And I think what you're seeing is now they have their backs to the wall. And if you look at what's happening as far as their policy decisions, and that's why I think this issue of bringing in the LNG cargoes and stopping the blackouts is really interesting because previously they had they had decreased the wheat subsidies for the first time in many years, clearly as sort of a signal to the IMF, a signal to international creditors like, hey, we're serious, we're going to get our house in order. But the fact that they then have to turn around and do that, I think really shows the dilemma that they're in, because the problem for countries like this is inflation erodes your support very quickly, like we spoke about in the Cuba instance. When people don't have enough to eat, that's a problem for any regime. And also when it's 41 degrees, which it is today in Cairo, you need to have the air conditioning on. You can't have blackouts. Otherwise, you're going to have a major problem on your hands. So there's just plenty of signs that this is sort of the wheels coming off more and more. And they did get a bit of a bailout from the UAE earlier this year. You mentioned Saudi, but even Saudi, they have growing problems of their own, which is a totally separate issue. So it's not something that, hey, this is a crisis today. I mean, it's been a slow motion crisis for a long time. But these things can change very rapidly, and it's worth planning and thinking ahead of time. Not that you necessarily would have business interests in Egypt, because obviously it's a very closed economy, but think of the spillover effects. What happens if you have inflation that really gets out of control? You have migration issues. You have, um, Egypt sits on and controls, the Suez Canal, through which 12% of all global container ship trade passes. So thinking through sort of the oblique potential issues that could arise if you have a major problem there is worth the exercise for sure.
Yeah, and it's an example of how things are changing and what countries are fundamentally screwed. Egypt at one point was a bread basket. Like Egyptian civilization, I didn't look if it was if it was the first. I know it was one of the first civilizations to actually farm wheat based on the Nile and the flooding of the Nile and things like that. The Romans valued Egypt because it was going to be a bread basket for the Roman Empire. For most of Egyptian history, Egypt, which is the land that is on the Nile River, was thought of as an agricultural. I mean, paradise is a little strong, but I mean, it was an agricultural powerhouse. And as recently as the 1950s, Egypt was self-sufficient when it came to wheat. It started importing grain towards the end of the 1950s, and that was partly U.S. food aid that the U.S. government was using to try and make countries like Egypt more dependent on the United States. That blew up in their face with Egypt because you get the rise of Nasser, and Egypt aligns itself with the Soviets for a period of decades. But it's really over the past 30, 40 years as the population has exploded. It's just not self-sufficient at all anymore. I was actually reading a paper before we got on, and it talked about Egypt has this very ambitious plan to double irrigated land area by 2035 in parallel with crop intensification that could make Egypt self-sufficient in the near future. The problem is, I mean, that's a lot of execution that you're going to have to do in an innovative way. And number two, if they even have baseline level population growth, they'll be importing again by the 2040s. I mean, this is a country of 120 million plus people. And the reason that you should have on your radar, I mean, I don't think there are a lot of, as you said, a lot of direct Egyptian investors here. But this affects the entire Middle East. Like when the Arab Spring starts in Egypt, it reverberates throughout the entire region. It is right across from Europe and places like Turkey. What happens if 10% of the Egyptian population decides it wants to cut and run? What happens if you have war between Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia over water issues? Like there's just a ton of negative scenarios that you can imagine there and spill out. But an interesting an interesting example of a country with immense natural resources that as a result of globalization and access to cheap food has grown beyond its means as a country to keep going. So it is completely dependent on others to keep things functioning. And there's really no way to change that going forward. Um, we were going to talk about a bunch of other things, Rob, but we're running out of time. So why don't we? I think we need to talk a little bit about Japan, and we need to talk a little bit about Vietnam. So why don't we talk about those two, and we will leave our last thing for next week, and I'll give the listeners a little tease at the end about what we were going to talk about, and they can go read the paper we were going to discuss, and we can discuss it next week. Um, let's take the easy one first, and then spend the bulk of our time on Japan. The easy one is that Vietnam's General Secretary Trong is dead at the age, I believe. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't even look at his age. I'm sorry, General Secretary. I don't know if you're 81 or if you're 80. Let's find out really fast. 80. Sorry about that. Mr. Tron. Um, Probably not that big of a deal for most folks, but if you're doing supply chains in Southeast Asia, if you are investing in companies like Apple, who have been talking about moving their production facilities out of China and into countries like Vietnam, like the number of companies and folks that are affected by seemingly innocuous things like this, I think, is worth talking about. And the reason it's so interesting is because Vietnam is a bit of a black box. It's really hard to get information there. We've known Trong was ill since at least the beginning of the year. He wasn't showing up for scheduled meetings. He was sending other folks in his stead. At the same time, he was overseeing this massive anti corruption drive, which was vaguely reminiscent of what Xi Jinping was doing at various points during his leadership in China, really purging rivals and things like that. And the upshot of that was Vietnamese politicians and officials were nervous to do anything. They weren't approving building out more infrastructure because they were nervous that they were going to get caught in the anti corruption furnace. And Vietnam is maxed out from a capacity perspective. If you are today wanting to move into Vietnam, that might sound nice on paper. There's not energy. There's not the factory. There are not the roads. The stuff isn't there for you to do those things. So I think there's two scenarios here. Either the knives came out beforehand and the new president has already fixed everything, and maybe we get a return to normalcy and Vietnam continues forward, or things are about to get real and you're about to get a real competition between all the various factions within Vietnamese politics. I bring it up not to give you any concrete answers, but just to say, I just want to underscore the pitfalls of nearshoring and deglobalization and why China has such a dominant position when it comes to manufacturing. Because when you manufacture something in China, it meets a baseline level of quality and cost, and it actually happens on time. You're not worried about these sorts of things. Anything you want to say about Vietnam before we turn to one of our favorite hobby horses in Japan?
The only thing I would add on Vietnam is I've noticed in the earnings season that has just started up, companies now clearly taking their cue from the political environment are starting to bash Vietnam openly again and talk
Mm,
about, how they've been a backdoor for Chinese exports, and we need to, implement the non-market economy designation for Vietnam again and start clamping down, which I think is interesting, in the light of Mexico and that conversation, because if you're thinking from an investment standpoint, whether it's financial capital or supply chain allocation and stuff like that, um, these spheres of influence become important because, I think large public companies feel okay to bash a company or a country like Vietnam in a way that they would not necessarily do for a country like Mexico,
mhm.
at least from what I'm seeing in sort of that bottom up way. So uh, just an observation there.
All right. Let's do 5 minutes on Japan, and then you got to get out of here because you got to run to an important meeting. Um, Here's the nice segue. Japan now has more than 3 million foreign residents living there for the first time. That's over 2.5% of the population. The largest group of foreign workers in Japan, at around 25%, are Vietnamese. So the Vietnamese are leaving Vietnam and going to Japan. But the reason we wanted to talk about Japan was the yen is suddenly strengthening. Wish our timing was a little better there. We were a little premature. The Nikkei is correcting. A Japanese government panel just agreed to a fourth annual record for increases in the country's minimum wage, so increasing it by over 5%. I don't know if you also saw this services inflation also in Japan. So what Japanese companies charge each other for services rose to 3%. So that's above that 2% goal that they have in general. But I'll get out of the way here and let you cook on Japan before we say goodbye to the listeners.
For Japan, it's really just checking in because we've been talking about this for a long time and have been bullish on Japan, God, since we first started working together years ago. Um, I think really the only thing to say about Japan is that everything is sort of all systems go, in terms of the virtuous cycle of reinflation, wage growth acceleration, interest rate normalization, confidence returning. You're just seeing a lot of those data points accumulate and accumulate. And just recently, the last monthly reading for workers' base pay in Japan. So the way that they report this is in terms of cash base salary or hourly pay plus bonuses. And what you had been seeing was like base pay was good, but a lot of the increase that companies have been doing was in the form of bonuses. Now, in the last month, you really saw an acceleration where base pay was up 2.7% year over year. That's the biggest year over year increase since 1993. So, whenever you can say in Japan that something is happening for the first time since 1993, that alone is telling you that the situation, the sort of normality that we've gotten used to for all these years of Japan being stagnant and boring is really starting to change. Just a few other quick anecdotes or data points. There was a piece in Bloomberg that was really interesting about how the trading activities in the JGB, the Japanese government bond market, are actually returning. And for the first time in many, many years, foreigners are actually interested in trading JGBs. So all the like old market makers in Tokyo, like none of these guys even speak English. They're all from, older guys from the bubble period who kind of were holdovers. Now they're all of a sudden super in demand, and people are trying to figure out how to even talk to these guys. And they used to have these meetings that no one would attend, and now everyone's going. So you just are seeing these data points about the infrastructure is sort of lighting back up and coming back into effect. The Nikkei market itself has been in a huge bull run, which is really interesting, and people are starting to pay attention. There was another piece in Bloomberg just today that the Ministry of Finance, I'm sorry, it's the Tokyo Stock Exchange, is considering allowing people to purchase not 100 shares of Japanese companies as a minimum, which is currently the minimum you can buy, but one share, which is reminiscent of, the introduction of fractional share trading and Robinhood and things like that in the US. Ultimately, what this is going to do is increase retail participation in the Japanese market. You mentioned the influx of foreigners. Putting it all together, things are really changing in Japan, and you're seeing a lot of these positive data points really accumulate. So just more and more bullish. This is a long-term story. It's not going to change on a dime. And the more that you see these data points come up, the more you can feel reassured that the self-reinforcing spiral, the self-reinforcing normalization is getting some legs. And if that happens, then that's a process that could last for a very long time.
Yeah, one of our friends over at Bespoke asked me a question. He said, if you were advising someone and you had to pick one country to invest in that was not the United States over the next sort of 15 to 20 years, which country would it be? And my first answer was, well, of course, one size doesn't fit all. It depends if you want growth. But I said, if what you want is, a conservative approach to growth over the period of the next 10 to 15 years, I think Japan is probably your best bet. So I'm with you there. Let's let you get out of here, Rob. Listeners, the name of the paper we were going to talk about, which we will talk about next week, is The Employment Effects of a Guaranteed Income, Experimental Evidence from 2 U.S. States. It's published in the National Bureau of Economic Research. I'm sure you all know how to use Google. It's free, but if you need help, you can email me and I will send you the paper. And Rob, we'll pick it up there next week. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.